There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that you only recognize as the hinges of your entire existence in retrospect. They don't announce themselves with thunder or trumpets, but with a quiet shift in the atmosphere, a change in the quality of the silence. For me, that moment arrived at 2:17 in the morning, under the sterile, honey-toned glow of the lobby lights, smelling of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. It was the moment Elias Thorne, a man who had until then been a collection of polite smiles and late-night conversations, fell asleep on my shoulder. It was such a simple thing, a gesture of exhaustion from a man I knew was running on fumes, but in the vast, echoing quiet of my life, it was a cataclysm. The weight of his head, the soft puff of his breath against my neck, the surrender in the line of his posture. It was a question asked without words, and I had no idea how to answer it. I sat there, a statue carved from equal parts terror and wonder, my entire world narrowing to that single point of contact. This, I thought, is how it begins. Or this is how it ends. To understand the seismic impact of that small gesture, you have to understand the landscape it occurred upon. My world was a carefully curated space of quiet observation. I worked the night shift at the Archway Grand, a hotel that prided itself on a kind of timeless, understated luxury. From 11 at night until 7 in the morning, I was the king of a silent, carpeted kingdom. My job title was night auditor, which was a formal way of saying I watched over the hotel while the city slept, ran the day's accounting, and existed as a solitary point of contact for the insomniacs, the early risers, and the lost souls who wandered the halls after midnight. I was a photographer by passion, a creature of light and shadow by trade, and the night shift suited me. It gave me solitude. It gave me uninterrupted hours to think, to edit my photos on a laptop behind the polished mahogany of the front desk, and to observe the strange, transient lives that flowed through the building. I had constructed a life that was safe, predictable, and bordered by thick, soundproof walls of my own making. I was content in my isolation, or so I had convinced myself. Loneliness, I had reasoned, was simply the price of admission for a life lived on one's own terms, a life free from the messy, unpredictable entanglements of the heart. Elias Thorne checked in on a Tuesday in early October, a whirlwind of confident energy that seemed to momentarily disrupt the lobby's placid atmosphere. He was tall, with a frame that spoke of a life before software consulting, maybe college sports, and hair the color of dark honey that was perpetually in a state of controlled chaos. He had a smile that was quick and genuine, and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, restless intelligence. He was a long-term guest, booked for 3 months on a consulting project for a major corporation headquartered a few blocks away. In the beginning, he was just that, a room number, a polite nod as he passed my desk on his way in or out at odd hours, a brief exchange about the weather. He was part of the hotel's ecosystem, a migratory bird settling in for a season, and I was the quiet naturalist observing from a distance. I noticed the way he always loosened his tie the second he stepped through the revolving doors, the sigh of relief almost audible. I noticed the way he'd sometimes pause in the center of the grand, empty lobby, looking up at the vaulted ceiling as if searching for an answer in the intricate plasterwork. He was a man who wore his expensive suits like a costume, and I found myself inexplicably curious about the person underneath. My feelings for him began as a low hum, a background frequency I could easily ignore. It was an aesthetic appreciation at first, the photographer in me drawn to the lines of his face, the way the low light caught the gold in his hair, the contrast between his polished professional exterior and the weariness that sometimes shadowed his eyes. I would catch myself framing shots of him in my mind. Elias, silhouetted against the pre-dawn glow of the streetlights filtering through the tall, arched windows. Elias, head bent over his phone, the blue light illuminating a thoughtful frown. Elias, laughing with a colleague in the bar, a rare and startlingly bright sound. He was beautiful, in a way that felt both classic and thoroughly modern, and my quiet admiration was a secret I kept tucked away, a photograph developed only in the darkroom of my own mind. It was harmless, I told myself. A silent, one-sided crush on a handsome stranger who would be gone in a few months. It was just another part of the scenery, another story unfolding in my silent kingdom that I had the privilege to witness, but not to touch. Our friendship, if you could call it that in the beginning, was built in the small, empty hours of the morning. It started with coffee. One night, about 2 weeks into his stay, he came down to the lobby around 1 in the morning, looking frayed and exhausted. He paced the length of the marble floor, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, tense murmur. I watched him from behind my desk, pretending to be absorbed in my spreadsheets. When he finally hung up, he scrubbed a hand over his face and walked over to me. "Is there anywhere to get a decent coffee at this ungodly hour?" he had asked, his voice rough with fatigue. I explained that room service had ended at 11 and the hotel's cafe wouldn't open for another 5 hours. I saw the hope drain from his face, leaving behind a stark, bone-deep weariness. It was a look I recognized. It was the look of the night shift, of pushing past your body's limits, of being utterly alone with a mountain of work. "But," I added, on an impulse that felt reckless, "the staff coffee machine in the back is terrible, but it's hot and it's caffeinated." I was about to make a pot. "You're welcome to a cup," a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it. "You might just be my hero, Leo," he said, and the easy way he used my name, which he must have read from my name tag, felt surprisingly personal. I led him through the discreet door behind the front desk into the quiet, fluorescent-lit corridor that was the hotel's central nervous system. The staff break room was a small, functional space with a scarred table, a few mismatched chairs, and the promised terrible coffee machine. As it sputtered and hissed to life, filling the sterile air with a bitter, earthy smell, we talked. He told me about the project he was on, a massive software integration that was proving to be a logistical nightmare. He spoke of lines of code like they were warring armies, of data streams like unpredictable rivers. He didn't dumb it down for me. He spoke to me as an equal, another person awake in the dead of night, sharing the strange camaraderie of the nocturnal. I, in turn, told him a little about my photography, about my love for capturing the city when it was empty and dreaming. He was a surprisingly intent listener, asking questions that showed he was genuinely curious, not just making polite conversation. He wanted to know what I looked for, what kind of light I preferred, why I chose to document the world in monochrome. "You see the bones of the city," he'd said, looking at me with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in a long time. "Everyone else sees the skin, the clothes. You see the structure underneath." That was the first night. He thanked me for the coffee, which he declared heroically bad, and went back up to his room looking marginally more human. The next night, he was back, and the night after that. It became our thing, a ritual. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, he would appear in the lobby, and I would nod toward the back. We'd sit in the ugly little break room, drinking terrible coffee out of thick ceramic mugs, the silence of the sleeping hotel wrapped around us like a blanket. Our conversations deepened. He talked about his hometown in Oregon, about his family, about the restlessness that kept him living out of suitcases. I talked about growing up in the city, about the first camera my grandfather gave me, about the quiet joy of developing a print and watching an image emerge from the chemical bath like a memory surfacing. We built a small, private world in that break room, a pocket of warmth and connection in the cold, impersonal space of the hotel. And the low hum of my admiration for him began to modulate, to change into a richer, more complex chord. It was no longer just a crush. It was becoming a treacherous, terrifying hope. I was beginning to care for him, deeply, and I knew, with a certainty that settled in my gut like a stone, that I was building my house on a fault line. He was a temporary guest. His departure date was a fixed point on the horizon, and I was a fool for letting myself forget it, even for a few hours in the middle of the night. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding pressure. It started with a phone call. I was on my break, sitting in our usual spot, when Elias came in, his face pale and drawn. He didn't speak, just sank into the chair opposite me and buried his face in his hands. The silence in the room was different this time. It was heavy, suffocating. After a long moment, he looked up, and his eyes were hollowed out. "They're moving up the deadline," he said, his voice flat. "By a month." And the whole system just crashed. The whole goddamn thing. I didn't know what to say. I knew from our talks how much pressure he was under, how this project was his chance to make partner at his firm. A month was an impossible timeline. I just nodded, pushing my own half-full mug of coffee across the table toward him. He took it, his fingers wrapping around the warmth, but he didn't drink. He just stared into the black liquid as if it held the answers. That night, our conversation wasn't about our pasts or our passions. It was about his present, his immediate, overwhelming crisis. He talked, and I listened, a silent anchor in his storm. He sketched out network diagrams on napkins, his hands moving with a frantic energy, his explanations becoming a torrent of technical jargon I didn't understand but followed through the sheer force of his desperation. He wasn't just tired anymore. He was drowning. This was the catalyst. This was the moment the unspoken rules of our late-night sanctuary began to dissolve. His need for coffee and conversation morphed into something deeper, a need for simple, human presence. He started spending more time in the lobby, not even pretending to be on his way somewhere. He'd bring his laptop down and work at one of the low tables in the grand seating area, just to be in the same cavernous room as me. He said the silence of his hotel room was too loud. I understood. The silence of a solitary room can be a screaming void when you're under immense stress. The ambient, sleeping silence of the hotel lobby, punctuated by the quiet clicks of my keyboard and the occasional chime of the elevator, was different. It was a shared silence. It was company. And then came the night that changed everything. The night that led directly to that cataclysmic moment of him falling asleep on my shoulder. He came down around 2, looking worse than I had ever seen him. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, and his movements were slow, as if he were wading through water. He bypassed the break room entirely and just walked over to the small, secluded alcove near the library, where 2 plush armchairs faced each other over a small table. I was on my official 15-minute break, so I followed him, carrying 2 mugs of the requisite bad coffee. He didn't speak when I sat down. He just took the mug, held it in both hands, and leaned his head back against the chair, closing his eyes. The silence stretched. It wasn't our usual comfortable silence. It was fraught with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical presence in the air between us. We sat like that for what must have been 10 minutes. I watched the tense lines around his mouth slowly soften, the tight knot of his shoulders begin to release. He looked fragile, stripped of all his usual charisma and confidence. He looked like a man who had been holding the world up and was finally, blessedly, letting it go. And then, without opening his eyes, he spoke. "I'm so tired, Leo." It was a whisper. A confession. It was the simplest statement of fact, but it landed in my chest with the force of a physical blow. It was a plea, an admission of vulnerability so raw and unguarded that it breached all my defenses. "I know," I whispered back. He shifted then, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He turned his body slightly in the chair, angling himself more toward me. Another minute of silence passed. And then, slowly, hesitantly, as if testing the air, he leaned. He leaned sideways, across the small gulf of space that separated our chairs, until the side of his head came to rest gently against my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending fired at once. It was the lightest touch, the weight of his head barely a pressure, but it felt like a brand. I could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of my uniform shirt. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo mixed with the day's fatigue. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild animal trapped in a cage. I was terrified to move, to breathe, terrified that any motion would break the spell and send him retreating back into himself. So I sat perfectly still, a living statue, my own exhaustion forgotten, my entire being focused on the man who had sought out this small, simple harbor in the middle of his storm. I looked at the top of his head, at the strands of dark honey hair, and I felt a wave of tenderness so powerful it almost broke me. This was new territory. The carefully drawn map of our friendship had just been set on fire. That first time, He only stayed there for a minute or two before he seemed to catch himself. He straightened up abruptly, a faint flush on his cheeks, and mumbled an apology about being so tired he was falling over. He didn't meet my eyes. He finished his coffee in 2 quick gulps, thanked me, and all but fled back to the elevator, leaving me alone in the quiet alcove with a racing heart and the lingering warmth on my shoulder. I thought that would be the end of it, a strange, singular event born of extreme stress. A boundary tested and then quickly reestablished. I was wrong. It was only the beginning of our ritual. The next night, he came down again, and we sat in the same 2 chairs. This time, there was no hesitation. After a few minutes of quiet talk, he simply leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't fall asleep, not completely. He just rested, his breathing evening out, his body going slack against mine. And I let him. I sat there, my arm a rigid pillar of support, my mind a chaotic symphony of questions. What did this mean? Was this just about comfort for him? Was he this physically familiar with all his friends? Or was he, in his own exhausted, nonverbal way, telling me something more? The ritual evolved. The alcove became our space. The quiet leaning became an unspoken expectation. Some nights we would talk, our voices low murmurs that barely disturbed the air, his words vibrating faintly through my shoulder and into my bones. Other nights, we would sit in complete silence, the only sounds the distant hum of the hotel and the soft rhythm of his breathing. The physical boundary between us began to blur, to dissolve in the late-night quiet. The space between our chairs seemed to shrink, until eventually, he started foregoing his own chair altogether. He would come down, grab his coffee, and then just sink onto the floor at my feet, leaning his back against my legs. The first time he did it, I nearly stopped breathing. He settled himself without a word, rested his head back against my knees, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. I looked down at the top of his head, my hand hovering in the air, aching with the desire to touch him, to run my fingers through his hair, to offer a comfort that went beyond just being a stationary object for him to lean on. But I didn't. I kept my hands clenched in my lap, a white-knuckled grip on my own self-control. This was his ritual, his need. I was a passive participant, a provider of silent support. To do more, to initiate my own touch, felt like it would be a transgression, a violation of the fragile, unspoken terms of our arrangement. It was a sweet and exquisite torture. To have him so close, to feel the warmth and weight of him, to be the person he sought out for this strange, intimate form of solace, was a gift I hadn't known how to ask for. But it was also agony. Each night, I would sit there, my body a landscape of want, my mind a battlefield. One part of me, the hopeful, romantic part, would analyze every gesture, every sigh, every quiet murmur. It would see the trust in the way he let himself be vulnerable with me. It would see a nascent affection in the way he sought me out, night after night. It would build elaborate castles of possibility in the air. The other part of me, the cautious, self-protective part, would systematically dismantle those castles, brick by brick. It would remind me that he was stressed, lonely, and far from home. I was a convenience, a warm body in the middle of the night. He was a drowning man, and I was a floating piece of driftwood. He wasn't choosing me. He was just clinging to the first thing he found. This wasn't romance, it was desperation. And when the crisis passed, when his project was done and his life returned to normal, he would float away, and I would be left alone in the water. One night, he was more asleep than awake, his head resting in my lap as I sat in the armchair. His breathing was deep and even, and he'd been silent for almost half an hour. I was reading a book, the small lamp on the table beside me casting a pool of warm light over the page and over his sleeping form. A strand of his hair had fallen across his forehead. Without thinking, my hand moved on its own accord, a traitor to my carefully constructed resolve. I reached out and gently brushed the hair back from his face. My fingers grazed his temple for a fraction of a second. His skin was warm, soft. It was an electric shock. He stirred in his sleep, a soft sound in the back of his throat, and settled more deeply, nuzzling his face against my thigh like a cat. My heart stopped. I froze, my hand still hovering near his head, my breath caught in my chest. He was asleep. He wouldn't know. But I knew. I had crossed a line, a boundary I had set for myself. I had touched him with intent, with tenderness, with all the unspoken affection I had been so carefully hoarding. The moment was terrifying, and it was beautiful. I slowly retracted my hand, my fingers tingling, and looked down at him, this brilliant, complicated man who had somehow found his way into the fortress of my life and fallen asleep in the courtyard. In that moment, watching him sleep, so peaceful and unguarded, the war inside me quieted. The hope and the fear collapsed into a single, overwhelming emotion: love. It was a quiet, aching, and deeply inconvenient love, but it was undeniably there. And I knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that I was in far deeper than I had ever imagined. The driftwood was no longer just driftwood. It had decided it wanted to be a lifeboat. The ritual continued for weeks, a silent constant in the chaos of his work life and the quiet predictability of mine. It became the new architecture of my nights. My shift was no longer defined by running reports and handling late check-ins. It was defined by the long, quiet hours before he appeared and the strange, charged intimacy of the hour we would spend together. I began to learn the topography of his exhaustion. I could tell by the slump of his shoulders how many hours he'd been awake. I could read the progress of his project in the lines of tension around his eyes. He, in turn, began to notice the small details of my world. He'd ask about the photograph I was editing, remembering details from our previous conversations about my work. He noticed when I got a haircut. He started bringing me snacks from the fancy vending machine on the third floor, overpriced salted caramel chocolates he knew I had a weakness for. These were small things, tiny gestures, but they felt like anchors in the ambiguous sea we were navigating. They were proof that he was seeing me, too. Not just as a convenient pillow, but as Leo. The project's new, impossible deadline was a shadow looming over both of us. The final week was a blur of brutal hours for him. He was a ghost haunting the hotel, surviving on caffeine and sheer force of will. He lost weight. His easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, haunted frown. Our ritual in the alcove became less about conversation and more about pure, unadulterated collapse. He would appear, looking utterly broken, and simply fold himself onto the floor, resting his head in my lap without a word, and be asleep within minutes. My role shifted from quiet companion to silent guardian. I would sit for an hour, sometimes longer, letting him get what little restorative rest he could. I would watch over him, my book forgotten in my lap, a fierce, protective feeling rising in my chest. I felt like a lighthouse keeper, tending to a single, precious flame in the middle of a vast, dark ocean. I knew that when the storm passed, the ship might sail on, but for now, my light was the only thing guiding him to a safe harbor, however temporary. I found a strange peace in that. My own feelings, my own agonizing hope and fear, became secondary to his immediate, desperate need for rest. It was enough, for now, just to be there. Then came the last night. The night the project was due. He didn't come down at 2. Or at 3. By 4 in the morning, a cold dread had started to creep into my veins. I imagined him collapsed in his room, or still at the corporate office, staring at a screen until his eyes bled. I was running the final audit reports, my mind a million miles away, when the elevator chimed. He stepped out, and for a second, I didn't recognize him. He was standing straight, not slumped. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a kind of stunned, hollowed-out relief. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on the day before, his tie loosened and askew, but he looked different. He looked like a soldier who had just walked off the battlefield. He walked toward me, a slow, weary smile touching his lips. "It's done," he said. His voice was hoarse. "We submitted it 10 minutes ago." "It's over, Elias." I breathed, a wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy washing over me. "Congratulations. I knew you could do it, I didn't," he said, his smile wavering. "There were a lot of times I didn't. I couldn't have." He trailed off, shaking his head slightly, as if he couldn't find the words. He looked past me, toward our alcove, and then back at me. It was my last break of the night. An unspoken question passed between us. I nodded, and we walked to our spot for what I knew, with a painful certainty, would be the last time. His flight was booked for the next afternoon. This was it. The end of the ritual. The end of our strange, nocturnal world. The mood was different. The desperate exhaustion was gone, replaced by a quiet, melancholy sense of finality. We sat in our usual chairs, the space between us feeling like a chasm again. He was sipping his coffee, but his gaze was distant. "So," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Back to Oregon?" He nodded. "For a week. Then, Boston, I think. A new project, a new hotel, a new city." The words were like stones dropping into a well. I could feel the walls of my carefully constructed world closing back in. He would move on, and I would remain here, in my silent kingdom, with nothing but the ghost of his presence and the memory of his weight against me. The pain of it was a sharp, physical ache in my chest. I had known this was coming, had prepared myself for it, but the reality was so much colder, so much more brutal than I had anticipated. He put his mug down and turned to me, his expression serious. "Leo," he started, his voice low. "I don't know how to thank you. For the coffee. For letting me. For everything. You kept me sane." "I mean that it was nothing," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I was just here." "No," he insisted, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "It wasn't nothing. It was everything." We sat in silence for a long moment, the air thick with unspoken things. All the nights of analysis, all the hope, all the fear, it all coalesced into this single, final moment. This was my last chance. I could let him go with a polite handshake and his safe travels, preserving the fragile shell of our friendship and my own heart from further damage. Or I could risk it. I could risk everything. He didn't lean on my shoulder. He didn't collapse at my feet. He just sat there, watching me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. The weariness was still there, deep in his bones, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something new. A question. It was the same question I had seen there on the very first night he fell asleep on me. But this time it was clearer, sharper. It wasn't born of exhaustion. It was born of something else. He was the unknowing initiator, the one who had started all of this with his unconscious need for comfort. But now, in this final moment, the choice felt like it was mine. He had built the bridge, piece by piece, night by night. It was up to me to decide whether to cross it. The silence stretched, and I realized he was waiting. He was waiting for me to give him a sign, a permission slip. The dynamic had flipped. For all these weeks, I had been the passive one, the receiver of his unconscious intimacy. Now, he was the one who was still, waiting, vulnerable. He broke the silence first, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm going to miss this," he said, and the simple, honest words shattered my resolve. "Me too," I whispered back, my voice thick. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. His throat worked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The air was electric. I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears, a slow, heavy thud. "Leo," he said, his voice cracking on my name. Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, impossible thing. It was so much more direct, so much more terrifying and wonderful than anything I had imagined. All my internal monologues, all my complex analyses, they all evaporated in the face of that one simple, devastatingly honest question. There were no more ambiguities, no more plausible deniability. There was only him, asking for permission to completely and irrevocably shatter the world we had built in the hopes of building a new one. My breath hitched. For a second, I couldn't speak. All the fear I had been suppressing rushed to the surface. The fear of being wrong, of being a temporary comfort, of having my heart broken when he left. But underneath the fear, there was a deep, quiet current of certainty. It was the same certainty I felt when I knew a photograph was perfectly composed. It was a feeling of rightness. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the small distance between our chairs, leaned forward, and gently, tentatively, pressed my lips to his. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not a kiss of pent-up desire. It was a kiss of quiet confession. It was hesitant, soft, a question and an answer all at once. His lips were chapped and tasted faintly of bad coffee. For a brief, perfect moment, the entire world stopped. There was no hotel, no night shift, no looming departure. There was only the soft pressure of his mouth against mine, the feeling of his hand coming up to gently cup my jaw, the silent, staggering relief of finally arriving at a place I had only ever dreamed of. When we pulled apart, the space between us was no longer a chasm. It was sacred ground. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and terror, and I saw my own feelings reflected there. "Okay," he whispered, a shaky breath of a word. "Yeah, okay." The aftermath was not the beautiful, seamless dawn I had imagined. It was a cold, gray, and silent morning. The kiss had shattered the ambiguity, but it had replaced it with a new, terrifying uncertainty. After that moment in the alcove, we had walked to the elevator in a daze, a charged silence hanging between us. He had squeezed my hand once, a quick, convulsive gesture, before the doors slid shut, leaving me alone in the lobby. I had expected a text, a call, something, but my phone remained silent. I finished my shift in a state of suspended animation, my mind replaying the kiss, the look in his eyes, his whispered, "Okay," over and over again, searching for meaning, for reassurance. I went home as the sun was rising, my heart a confusing mix of soaring hope and gnawing anxiety. I fell into a restless sleep, dreaming of airports and missed connections. When I woke up in the early afternoon, the first thing I did was check my phone. Nothing. I checked again an hour later. Still nothing. The anxiety began to curdle into a familiar, bitter disappointment. I had been a fool. I had mistaken a moment of post-crisis emotional overflow for something real. He was leaving. The kiss had been a goodbye, a strange, intimate period at the end of a sentence. It wasn't the beginning of a new chapter. Around 3 in the afternoon, his checkout time, I couldn't stand it anymore. I called the front desk, my heart pounding, and spoke to my daytime colleague, Sarah. "Hey, Sarah, it's Leo. Quick question. Did Mr. Thorne in 1208 check out yet?" I tried to keep my voice casual, professional. "Oh, yeah, ages ago," she said, her voice breezy. "He did an express checkout around 9 this morning. Left in a real hurry. Said he had to catch an earlier flight," she paused. "He left an envelope for you at the desk, though. I was going to leave it in your mailbox, an envelope." My heart leaped, a wild, stupid hope. Could you open it and read it to me?" I asked, unable to wait. I heard the sound of paper tearing. "Sure," Sarah said. "It's short. It just says, 'Leo, thank you for everything. Safe travels, Elias, safe travels.'" The words were a punch to the gut. The formal, impersonal sign-off he'd used with a bellhop who helped with his bags. Not "talk soon," not "I'll call you," just "safe travels." The hope that had been soaring in my chest plummeted, crashing and burning. I mumbled my thanks to Sarah and hung up, the phone feeling heavy and cold in my hand. He was gone. He had run. The man who had trusted me with his exhaustion, who had slept in my lap, who had asked to kiss me, had fled without a word, leaving behind a polite, meaningless thank you note. The pain was sharp and blinding. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was humiliation. I had allowed myself to be so vulnerable, had built him up into something so significant in my mind. I had crossed the line I had sworn I would never cross. And for what? To be left feeling like a convenience, a temporary emotional rest stop on his journey to somewhere else. The walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart came crashing back into place, thicker and higher than before. The night shift, my silent kingdom, suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison cell. The next few days were a special kind of hell. The hotel lobby felt vast and empty, haunted by his absence. Our alcove was just a pair of chairs again. The staff coffee machine produced a liquid that was no longer heroically bad, just bitter and undrinkable. Every chime of the elevator made my head snap up, a stupid, Pavlovian response, expecting to see him walk out, a sheepish smile on his face. But he never did. The silence he left behind was heavier than any we had ever shared. It was a dead, suffocating silence, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and the bitter taste of regret. I threw myself into my work, into my photography, trying to exorcise him from my thoughts. I walked the city streets at dawn, taking pictures of empty alleyways and sleeping storefronts, trying to find beauty in the solitude I had once cherished. But everything felt gray. The world had lost its color. I had let him in, just for a moment, and he had taken all the light with him when he left. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for being so willing to initiate a profound intimacy and then so terrified to face its consequences. But mostly, I was angry at myself. Angry for being so naive, for misreading every signal, for daring to hope. I had broken my own first rule: never invest in the transient. And now I was paying the price. I resolved to forget him. I would pack away the memory of him like an old photograph, a relic from a past life. He was just another guest, another story that had played out in my hotel. It was over. It was almost a week later. I was at work, sitting behind the desk, staring blankly at my laptop screen, when the main hotel phone rang. It was just after 3 in the morning. I answered with my standard, professional greeting. Archway Grand Hotel, Leo speaking. How may I help you? There was a pause on the other end of the line, just the faint hiss of static. Leo. The voice was hesitant, rough, but I would have known it anywhere. My heart seized in my chest. It was Elias. For a moment, I couldn't find my own voice. 1,000 emotions warred inside me. Fury, relief, confusion, a ridiculous, unbidden surge of joy. Elias. I finally managed, my voice coming out colder and flatter than I intended. Hi, he said, and he sounded terrible. His voice was strained, exhausted. I know I shouldn't be calling. I'm sorry. I know it's late. It's my job to be awake, I said, the words clipped. What can I do for you, Mr. Thorne? Did you leave something in your room? The formal address was a deliberate cruelty, a way of rebuilding the wall he had demolished. There was a long, painful silence on the other end. I could hear him take a shaky breath. Please don't do that, he whispered. Don't call me that. I didn't answer. I just waited, my knuckles white where I gripped the receiver. I'm an idiot, Leo, he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't place. I'm a coward. What I did, leaving like that, it was unforgivable. I panicked. You panicked. I repeated, the words flat and devoid of emotion. Yes, he said, the word rushing out of him. I got back to my room after that night, and I couldn't breathe. Everything was too much. What happened between us, it was not something I was expecting. It was not something I have ever experienced before. He fumbled for the words. With a man. I've never, and it felt so right. And that scared the hell out of me. It didn't fit into any of the boxes I've built for my life. So I did what I always do when I get scared. I ran. His confession hung in the air, a raw and painful admission. He was confirming everything my hopeful heart had dared to believe, and everything my fearful mind had dismissed. It wasn't just me. It wasn't a mistake. It was real for him, too. So real it had terrified him. The anger in my chest began to dissolve, replaced by a familiar, aching tenderness. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, as lost and confused as I had been, just in a different way. This past week, he continued, his voice cracking, has been the longest week of my life. I thought if I just got away, if I put some distance between us, I could just file it away. Pretend it didn't happen. Go back to normal. But there is no normal anymore. Every quiet moment, all I can think about is sitting in that stupid, ugly break room with you. Every time I close my eyes, I remember how it felt to just rest. With you. Nothing has ever felt that safe. He took another shuddering breath. The silence here is too loud, Leo. It's just like you said, my own eyes were burning. The fortress around my heart was crumbling again, its stones turning to dust. Where are you, Elias? I asked, my voice soft now. I'm in Boston, he said. In a hotel room that looks exactly like the one I just left. And I'm so lonely. And I'm so sorry. I messed everything up. You did. I said, the honesty simple and clean, without malice. You really hurt me. I know, he whispered. I know. Is there any way I can fix it? Can I come back? Come back. Not to the hotel. Just back to the city. This weekend. I can take a train. I need to see you, Leo. I need to talk to you. Not on the phone, and not in the middle of the night in a hotel lobby. In the daylight. If you'll let me, the hope I thought had been extinguished, that I had buried under layers of anger and disappointment, stirred again. It was a fragile, tender green shoot pushing its way through scorched earth. He wanted to come back. He wanted to see me. In the daylight. It was everything I had been too afraid to even wish for. Okay, Elias, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face, a real one this time. Come back. His arrival was nothing like the first time he had checked into the hotel. There was no whirlwind of charisma, no expensive suit. He appeared at my apartment door on a Saturday afternoon, looking tired and nervous, holding a single, sad-looking paper coffee cup like a shield. He was wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater, and without the armor of his professional life, he looked younger, more vulnerable. He looked like the man from the alcove, the man who had whispered his exhaustion to me in the dead of night. My apartment, a small space I had filled with my books, my photographs, and the scent of darkroom chemicals, suddenly felt too small, too intimate. The daylight streaming through the window felt harsh and revealing after the soft, forgiving glow of our nocturnal world. We stood there in the doorway for a moment, a new kind of awkwardness between us. This was real life. There were no uniforms, no front desks, no unspoken rules of a transient space to hide behind. It was just us, Leo and Elias. Hi, he said, his voice quiet. Hi, I replied, stepping back to let him in. That coffee smells terrible. By the way, a small, grateful smile touched his lips. It is. It's from the train station. I thought. I don't know what I thought. It felt appropriate. I took the cup from him and poured it down the sink. I can make you a decent cup, I said, gesturing toward my kitchen. For a change, as the coffee maker gurgled, filling the small apartment with a rich, warm aroma, the tension slowly began to ease. He stood in the doorway of my kitchen, his hands shoved in his pockets, looking around at my space. His eyes lingered on the photographs I had pinned to a large corkboard on the wall, black and white images of empty streets, rain-slicked pavement, the skeletal shapes of trees in winter. These are yours, he stated, more than asked. I see it now. The bones. He walked over to the board, his gaze settling on one particular photo. It was a shot I had taken from the hotel's roof just before dawn, looking down at the empty street, a single taxi a yellow blur in the blue-gray light. It was a photo about loneliness and quiet beauty, a perfect encapsulation of my world before him. I was so scared, he said, his back still to me. What I felt for you, it just didn't compute. My whole life has been a straight line. Go to a good school, get a good job, make partner, find a nice girl, get married. It was a clear path. And you weren't on the path. You were a whole new landscape I hadn't even known existed. And standing on the edge of it felt like I was going to fall. He turned to face me then, his eyes full of a raw, pleading honesty. But being back on the path without you, it's just empty. It's a road to nowhere. I was so terrified of what it meant to feel something for you that I didn't stop to think about what it would mean to feel nothing without you. I leaned against the counter, the warmth of my own coffee mug seeping into my hands. So what are you saying, Elias? I asked, my voice gentle. I needed to hear the words. In the clear light of day, I needed the certainty. He walked toward me until he was standing just a few feet away. I'm saying, he began, his voice gaining a strength I hadn't heard since his call, that I am tired of living out of suitcases. I'm tired of running. I'm saying that the safest I have ever felt in my entire life was when I was half asleep on the floor of a hotel lobby with my head in your lap. And that has to mean something. It has to mean more than my stupid, pre-approved life plan. He took a deep breath, closing the last bit of distance between us. He reached out, not to kiss me, but to take my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His hand was warm and solid. It felt like an anchor. I don't know what this is, Leo, he said, looking down at our joined hands. I don't know how this works. I've never done this before, but I want to find out. With you. If you're still willing to, if you can forgive me for being a coward." I looked at him, at this brilliant, complicated, terrified man who had stumbled into my life and turned it upside down. I saw the fear still in his eyes, but I also saw a fierce, determined hope. It was the same hope that was blooming in my own chest. The risk was still there. The future was still a vast, unmapped territory. But for the first time, the thought of exploring it wasn't terrifying. It was exhilarating. "There's nothing to forgive," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I squeezed his hand. "You came back. That was the real beginning. Not the first conversation, not the first touch, not even the first kiss. It was this moment of mutual, terrifying, hopeful honesty in the clear light of a Saturday afternoon. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know where the path would lead. But for the first time, we were both facing the same direction, ready to take the first step together. The silence that fell between us then was not empty or awkward or charged with unspoken tension. It was a new kind of silence. It was peaceful. It was full. It was the silence of coming home. We began to build our new life in the quiet spaces, just as we had built our friendship. Elias didn't go back to Boston. He called his firm, told them he was taking a personal leave, and rented a small, furnished apartment a few blocks from mine. It was a temporary solution, a foothold in this new landscape we were trying to navigate. Our days were a study in gentle discovery. We explored the city not as a tourist and a native, but as two people learning the topography of each other. I showed him my favorite hidden corners, the quiet parks and old bookstores he would never find on a map. He told me stories from his travels, filling in the gaps of the man I had only known in a state of crisis. We learned to talk in the daylight, to argue about small things like where to get the best pizza, to laugh, a sound that was still startlingly bright and wonderful. But our true language remained the one we had first learned in the dead of night, the language of quiet presence. The greatest comfort was not in the grand romantic gestures, but in the simple, domestic intimacy of sharing space. It was in sitting on my old sofa, reading our own books, his leg pressed against mine. It was in the easy way he now reached for my hand as we walked down the street. It was in the way he would show up at my apartment after a long day, not needing to talk, but just needing to be in the same room, to unwind in the shared silence that had become our sanctuary. The ghost of the hotel lobby still lingered, but it was no longer a source of pain. It was our foundation myth, the story of our beginning. One evening, a few weeks after he came back, he was at my place, helping me organize a box of newly developed prints. We were on the floor, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of my work. He picked up a photograph. It was one I had taken of him, a candid shot from one of our last nights in the alcove. He was asleep, his head in my lap, the lamplight casting soft shadows on his face. He looked peaceful, vulnerable, completely surrendered to the moment. I hadn't even realized I had taken it. It must have been an unconscious act, my photographer's instincts taking over. He was quiet for a long time, just looking at the image. "I don't remember this," he said softly, "but I remember how it felt. I was so lost then. And you were my lighthouse." He looked up at me, the photograph held gently in his hands. "Do you still work the night shift?" he asked. I nodded. "For now. It pays the bills. Does it still feel like a kingdom?" he asked, a knowing look in his eyes. "Or does it feel like a prison?" I thought about it. I thought about the long, silent hours, the echo of my own footsteps on the marble floor. It had been my safe harbor for so long, my fortress against the world. But he was right. Since meeting him, the walls had started to feel less like protection and more like confinement. The solitude I had once cherished now often felt like simple loneliness. "It's just a job," I said, the admission feeling momentous. "My kingdom is here now," he smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He put the photograph down carefully and crawled across the floor to me. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a hug that was solid and real and blessedly unambiguous. I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, and held on tight. There were no more questions, no more agonizing analyses. There was just this The warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against my chest, the profound and simple peace of being held by the person you love. We didn't need words. We had learned to speak in the quiet. We had learned that the most important things are not always said, but are felt in the weight of a head on a shoulder, in a hand reached for in the dark, in the shared breath that fills a silent room. We had started in the borrowed time of the night shift, in the transient space of a hotel lobby, a relationship built on exhaustion and unspoken need. But what we found, in the end, was not temporary. We began to heal, not in grand pronouncements or dramatic confessions, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. It was a silence that was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet, steady, and miraculous sound of a shared life beginning.